Well, tonight we delve deeper into the EU's evolving role with two distinguished guests. Kamila Romanowska, Professor of EU Law and Security Studies in Brussels, and Professor Gilles-Emmanuel Jacquet, a Vice President of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute. Together we will explore the forces shaping Europe's delicate balancing act between China and Iran, and of course the United States as well. Welcome to you both. I hope I didn't mess up your names too much at the beginning. Professor Romanowska, let's start with you. How is the EU managing to balance relations between China and the United States, especially as the US policies are becoming more unpredictable?
Well, indeed, that's the question. US policy is becoming more unpredictable. But in my opinion, the EU was quite aware of what might happen. And they are not now only simply balancing between China and the United States. EU is crafting a mediating posture that stabilizes international relations in the era of escalating great power competition, even greater perhaps than perhaps a Cold War. First of all, by pushing strategic autonomy, Europe creates space for independent mediation, clearly, building credibility as a moderator and arbitrator as well of tensions, rather than just a passive ally. Moreover, Europe's diplomatic architecture, grounded in the multilateralism, normative power and dialogue, allows broker agreements, de-escalate trade tensions, and offer compromise pathways where the direct channels between US and China simply falter. Moreover, there is a difficult issue which is going on, and this is some sort of binary confrontation Europe is sometimes facing. And what they're trying to do is actually positing themselves as a guardian of multipolar balance in the world. And that's the reason why they're really doing their best to facilitate cooperation and compromises, as well as dialogue without submission. That's the reason why I really would like to highlight my stance that EU leverage autonomy is not isolating themselves, but it's rather to become an anchor of global stability, shaping the future where Europe sets the tempo and terms of its great power engagement. And this is not things which just happen overnight, just because, let's say, European Union and is set in difficult position because of Mr. Donald Trump return and the war in European Union is creating quite steadily just before the Brexit even went into the question. They create stably conversation and then a whole, I would say, very intelligently crafted plan to actually become a global independent strategy. So that's the reason why, independent actor. That's the reason why they created EU global strategy to actually become as well global player, to become as well independent from either of the strongest player who now are stepping aside to Europe, to India, to Gulf states, etc.
And what do you think, Professor? Okay, do you think that Trump's trade war has impacted or even changed the EU's strategy when it comes to their economic outlook?
Thanks for the invitation. Well, more generally, I think it's not just about this trade war, this US-Chinese trade war, but simply following the change in the US administration with the second mandate of President Trump. The European Union, that previously relied a lot on the Biden administration, and more generally on the US to back its strategic autonomy, now is left in a way alone. And this issue of the US-Chinese trade war is leaving the European Union in a situation where it has to make choices with regard to its future. So we hear a lot about this strategic autonomy. Maybe it should have been interesting since the beginning to talk maybe about strategic independence. It's maybe what had been envisioned in '91 after the end of the Cold War, when we were talking about a common European, let's say, house. But now the European Union is left in a different situation. It's not just about, by the way, the change in the US government. It's also since the Russian invasion in Ukraine and all the consequences it had on the world order. It's the end of the previous, let's say, post-Cold War world order in which the European Union was trying to operate in tandem with the US. So to get back now on the topic of trade and the relations with China, the European Union has to gain some leverage as well to make, let's say, a partnership in a way with China to have more weight against the United States with regard to many different negotiations, not just with regard to the Chinese trade issue. So we see some interesting changes as well. Some members of the European Parliament may see soon some sanctions, Chinese sanctions lifted. The former, as well, Greek finance minister said that we had in a way no choice than strengthening ties with China. But now as well, there are other challenges because we know that many EU countries, EU politicians, I mean, national politicians like Raphael Glucksmann or others are very vocal against China when it comes to human rights. And human rights in China is a red line as well, defined by the European Union. So we'll see how this issue will be treated in the future. And the other thing as well is that China is looking as well for, let's say, market opportunities, especially for higher quality products. And the European Union could be an interesting market for that. But at the same time, Ursula von der Leyen talked about de-risking, let's say, limiting vulnerabilities, dependencies of the European Union, which is at the same time, let's say, a wise approach, which has been adopted already in the past. And some people would say maybe to push the EU to do some kind of protectionism, even though it's not supposed to do so. So we'll see what's left, but with China, there is, let's say, a kind of window of opportunity, but with many challenges, such as human rights, and as well the reindustrialization of Europe to have a proper counterweight to China's growing influence in trade as well.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure human rights is going to be a big issue when it comes to China. We'll come back to China in just a moment. Professor Romanowska, I just wanted to bring in this Iran story that we mentioned, that Iran is reaching out to the E3, France, Germany, and Britain, to have separate negotiations outside of the ones between Iran and the United States. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, we have to look here for the very important issue that EU approach to Iran's nuclear negotiation differed from both China and US, and there are different implications as such when it comes to the global non-proliferation efforts. Because first of all, EU's approach to Iran reflects a very carefully calibrated fusion of strategic interests, normative commitments, and global influence building. First of all, whereas the United States often view Iran through security and electoral lens, and China through transnational economic perspective, Europe adapts, I would say, more multi-dimensional strategy, combining realpolitik, principal diplomacy, and long-term structured engagement, as well as engagement towards the partners in the MENA region. First of all, Europe as a nation is not act of charity, of simple moralism. We have to look at it very carefully because it's as well EU strategic interest in the basin of Mediterranean, which is extremely important, and it's as well European Sea. It's a clear investment and a very clever one in the stability of immediate neighborhood, because a nuclear-armed Iran would be a threat to Europe's security. It will spark regional arms race and destabilize energy routes, which are critical to Europe's economy, that's for sure. Then we have to take into account as well that there's a failed and non-proliferation framework, which would definitely erode in the modern, in the broader international legal order that underpins Europe's prosperity and political model. And moreover, a breakdown of diplomacy would trigger renewed migration flows, which is extremely important now for Europe. This will induce humanitarian crises, increase terrorism, and all of which have very direct strategic consequences to the EU and to EU strategic partners, for instance, is Egypt or Morocco, Tunisia, etc., Turkey for sure. We have to look at this from a European perspective, which is more broader than just one go action, because EU's mediation serves Europe's core strategic interests. They are to ensure a secure, stable, and predictable environment in region, which is critical of its own future. We cannot really, let's say, allow ourselves to another crisis as it was after the Arab Spring and the war in Syria started in 2015. We just, especially now when there is a quite difficult economical issues and economic situation. Moreover, these human rights and normative values remains always an integral and non-negotiable part of Europe diplomacy. Even engaging quite pragmatically with Tehran, the EU will continue to apply targeted sanctions on Iranian officials responsible for human rights abuses, that's for sure, especially in the cases of arbitrary retentions or suppression of civil society. The European Parliament and European External Action Service, EAS, they will constantly advocate for rights of women, minorities, or dissidents in Iran. That will not stop. Moreover, through dialogue, legal pressure, and conditional engagement, Europe will seek not only to prevent nuclear proliferation, but moreover, they will do their best to nurture social openings and uphold universal human rights standards. That's one of the most important things, and Europe will not stand out. Because this distinguishes Europe fundamentally from both US short-termism and Chinese how values neutral pragmatism. And third thing is that Europe actively is reinvesting in its global role. This is not merely as diplomatic mediator, but this is actually something stronger as a builder of alternative future. For instance, there is a program of global getaway, and Europe is giving 300 billion euro in infrastructure and connectivity plan. And it's offering the countries like Iran and wider in the region alternative to Chinese Belt and Road dependency. Europe's investment strategies are to promote sustainable development, human rights, transparency, and local empowerment. This is quite parallel to UN values, but contrastingly starkly with extractive of debt trap models, which are promoted by others. Then these reinvestment programs are not peripheral. They are as well central piece of Europe's new external action doctrine, even, I would say, because they are showing that diplomatic influence are backed by real economical power, real economics, real credibility, and on-the-ground impact. Then we have to look at this as a really huge change when it comes to the 21st century strategic diplomacy, because they are defending hard interests. They are projecting normative leadership like human rights or rule of law, and they are expanding structural influence through investment in connectivity, resilience, and sustainable development, even through the United Nations. Though in broader terms, the implications of global non-proliferation are profound, because EU will prove that diplomacy rooted in strategic patience and principled engagement can succeed, and then they will.
Well, let me just bring Professor Jacquet back in here. What do you think is the significance of Iran's call for these separate talks with Europe on its nuclear program, and is human rights another stumbling block here?
Well, Iran knows very well that in this current situation where the European Union is detached from the US, it's an opportunity to strengthen the talks based on the safeguard of JCPOA and the negotiations on the nuclear issue. Now, for the European Union as well, we know that there is a coherent approach. It's not new that they want as well a comprehensive agreement with Iran. There are as well conditions related to human rights, treatment of minorities and women. And we'll see how this issue will be treated in the future, because we cannot really predict what can happen in Iran. If there are protests or these things, we'll see how Brussels will really stand. On the nuclear issue, it's very important as well to have the European Union on board. However, with regard to the current relations with Russia, between Brussels and Russia, that will be an issue, because in the past, when Moscow, Brussels, and some European capitals like Paris, Berlin, or others were partnering on this similar approach, a coherent approach, it was quite, let's say, influential, and it was limiting as well the more hawkish approaches we had from the US and Israel. The other issue as well, even though each issue, let's say the Israeli conflict, the nuclear issue and others are all detached, treated separately by the European Union. In fact, they are all in a way tied because of regional conflicts and regional issues. So based on as well the previous stance of Ursula von der Leyen with regard to what happened in Gaza, let's see if the European Union as well will have a different stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it could as well be an obstacle in better relations with regard to the nuclear issue in Iran, and more generally the other issues Brussels would like to deal with Tehran, especially the issue of migration, because Iran is an important transit country for Afghan migrants, and Iran has a significant as well a population of Afghans. So for Tehran there is an opportunity, but let's see if this strategic autonomy Brussels would like to display will be really able to make a change, because Germany is influential in this process, but we had as well challenges in the bilateral relations between Berlin and Tehran with regard to operations conducted by Iranian intelligence services in Germany and the spying over Iranian dissidents.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to China with you, Professor Romanowska. Do you see China's recent diplomatic overtures as a genuine attempt to reset relations with the European Union?
Well, China diplomatic overtures toward the European Union are fundamentally calculated response to strategic pressure, rather than purely genuine attempt at rapprochement, in my opinion. Beijing motivation are threefold: mitigation, isolation, tension with Washington escalates, especially over critical technologies, Taiwan, and supply chains. China needs to prevent full Western coalition forming against them, and Europe is essential in that calculus. Second thing is that securing economic lifelines is very important as well. Those lifelines are growing from barriers to the American markets and slowly domestic growth. Beijing views Europe, of course, as a European market, as a vital for maintaining export and driven economic stability. Export-driven economic stability is for them a must. But there is a shaping global narratives. By courting to the EU, China aims to present itself globally as a cooperative power, contrasting itself with US unilateralism, especially among the global South, especially as well bearing in mind China's engagement with Russia now. Nevertheless, the EU is fully aware of its dynamics and approaches China overtures with strategic sobriety, I would say, because Europe demands substantial changes and challenges for China, for sure. This is not just superficial gesture. They're including progress on market access, for sure, Europe, international property protection and human rights, particularly in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and transparency. That's important part of EU diplomacy and EU law as well. They are about to lift some Chinese sanction, and European officials will be happy to see so. But it's not as a concession, but as necessary precondition of re-engagement, in my opinion. Furthermore, I would say that Europe is actually actively de-risking its supply chains and adopting measures such as anti-coercion instrument or foreign subsidies regulation that protect themselves from systemic vulnerabilities, linked to China. And that's really important, because if European market, European production, and European SMEs and society will not be let's say vulnerable, it will minimize Chinese leverage, and it will show European strength and not weakness. That's the reason why this independent strategy is
well, thank you both very much, Professor Zaraczta Romanowska and also Professor Jacquet as well. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.